Hey, all, welcome. How's everybody doing today? Good? All right. Well, thanks for being here today for this year's fourth McGovern Lecture in Health Communication. For those of you who aren't familiar, my name is Mike Mackert. For people online that don't know us yet, I'm the director of the UT Austin Center for Health Communication. And the McGovern Lecture has been going on since 1983, thanks to a gift from the John P. McGovern Foundation. And as long as I've been at UT and its history, it's always been a chance to bring in kind of different prominent speakers in medicine and public health and communication to sort of bring them to campus and share. And this year we had the chance to convert into a speaker series, which has been really fun to hear kind of different people from varied backgrounds talking about a variety of health issues. And so today's actually our fourth in the series. But really quickly, I want to share a little bit kind of just about John McGovern himself and where this comes from. And so Dr. McGovern was a noted allergist, scholar, and philanthropist, and he's considered one of the state's and country's most significant figures in the history of medicine and healthcare. He was son of a surgeon, and he graduated from Duke University School of Medicine in 1945, and eventually he ended up in 1956 moving to Houston to join the Baylor faculty. He opened an allergy clinic in Houston. He combined hands-on medical practice with research and teaching. He published dozens of articles and books about allergies, and he was really defined by a humanistic approach to medicine, treating the whole person and not just the illness, which, you know, it always means a lot to us here at the Center for Health Communication as we think about how we can bring together research, education, and practice in the work that we get to do. And so it's really an exciting part of what we do. Really quickly, I do want to say thanks to the Center for Health Communication team for making this happen. We all, I think, knew theoretically that going from one speaker to four was going to be 4 times the work, and yet we realized this is definitely 4 times the work. And so really want to say thanks to Brianna, Alyssa, everyone involved in kind of planning the events and all the promotions and the design and all the work. It takes a large village to do all this. So thanks to them. That deserves a round of applause here. And our fourth speaker, I'm really excited to welcome in Dr. Maria Elena Bottazzi. She's a senior associate dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine, professor of pediatrics and molecular virology and microbiology, and co-director of the Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. It was really exciting. We actually just got to hear her talk 2 hours ago at the People's Community Clinic luncheon this afternoon. And we were really excited to partner and bring her to campus today to talk about the role of her work and how communication is part of doing something like developing a free open source COVID vaccine. I was jotting down new questions I wanted to ask as she was presenting at the People's Community Clinic luncheon. Thanks again, Joy here is from the People's Community Clinic. So Joy, thanks again for the partnership to bring Dr. Bottazi here. And thanks for being here today. We're really excited.
Oh, no, it's my great pleasure. I always like to communicate, I hope. And just, I had to jump on this opportunity and not only come and spend some time with the People's Community Clinic, but then see how I could extend my storytelling to all of you and to those who are listening to us on somewhere in Zoom. Very happy to hear that we're primarily women in this room, maybe except for N of 2. So it's always great to come here and tell a little bit of my story and answer any questions you might have.
Awesome. Well, as a little bit of background, I mean, you gave us, I think, the short version of your story at the People's Community Clinic luncheon too, but would you be willing to kind of recount a little bit of that story to get things going as context for all the folks here who didn't hear you already today?
Sure, absolutely. So I think all of us come most likely with many roots, cultures from, different paths in life. Mine started by the fact that my father was a Honduran diplomat. So he was born in Honduras, but also himself coming from an Italian Honduran kind of like marriage mixture, but ended up being a diplomat even back in Italy. So ultimately, as you can see, the Honduras Italian is pretty strong in my heritage. So I was born in Italy, but I then eventually moved to Honduras and I was raised there. So I went through all my schooling. I remember vividly how, in fact, talking a little bit about the power of language, my first language was Italian, but very rapidly I had to learn Spanish, and it happened that I was in an American school. So it was Spanish, Italian, English, all kind of mixed together. and we know how flexible our brains of children, but I have to say I do remember that it's not necessarily easy, right? I mean, trying to handle many languages and then coming from Italy and going through a very different system, even in schooling. But that said, one of the things that probably happened, is those things that you don't really know for sure. But I was always fascinated by sciences. I didn't really like history, which I regret now. I didn't really particularly pay a lot of attention to maybe the, social studies or, some of these other, classes in school. But I was definitely very interested in biology, chemistry, some physics, maybe not as much, but clearly the biological topics. And that's what probably enticed me to go into a university degree that ended up being microbiology. But I have to say, like everybody, and I see this with many young students now, everybody always thinks that for you to serve in medicine or serve in biology or biomedical sciences, you have to become a doctor, right? So yes, when I was little, I wanted to be a doctor, but very rapidly found out that clearly being a physician is absolutely fantastic. But physicians only can do what they do when they are surrounded by many other disciplines that support their endeavor to really treat or attend to the people that they, of course, are serving. And microbiology is one of those. Microbiology, as the word says, we study the microbes or all these gazillion pathogens we have, unfortunately, that lives with us. Some of them, of course, are much more important because they are pathogenic. Others, in fact, they're not, and they help us being healthy, like the microbiota that we have in our, in our bodies. But beyond studying the microbes, I think what really was very interesting to me is what did those learnings do for us, right? It's not understanding just where these microbes come from or how they are made of, how they interact with the hosts, but then how do you develop tools that could help us identify them better, faster? How can we prevent them if they indeed cause disease? And eventually, even how can we treat them if they were to, in fact, already cause a disease? And that is, very unique because then it kind of brings together the biomedical concepts of microbiology, but also how to design techniques, tools, technologies that then require many other skills. And I think that's what happened eventually as I evolved studying. My family is also a pretty entrepreneur, business, economics, all sorts. I'm the only real scientist within the family. That really was interested in biology as a concept, and so then I said, I really like this combination of business and biology or microbiology, or the use of economics and biology, and eventually, I think throughout my career, I started finding how to acquire those skills. So yes, I studied micro. Then, of course, I did the traditional Ph.D. where you expand, in some of these immunology and other, disciplines. But then started saying, okay, I want to learn about business. So when I was doing a postdoc, I started a master in business administration. And then I was really interested in, how do you translate all this information, and started looking for opportunities to stack up my credentials. Like, one of the things that I'm very proud is started working with the American Association for Advancement for Science, and they are the place to go if you really want to get at least the 101 on communication skills. And then got, elected as one of their fellows in the Leshner Fellowship, which is specifically how to learn science engagement. And that's pretty much how eventually you kind of round up your competencies, right? You can be sort of a jack of all trades, but still specialize in what you like. But then I have to say I lucked out by combining them with many other many other disciplines that really rounded up, not only my personality, but also the way that we can advocate for the things that we do.
Well, so I remember in March, April, May 2020, we started getting messages and people were like, oh, it seems to be important how we communicate about health. And for people on this team and people focused on health comm, it's like, we kind of knew that already. But a lot of people were having their eyes open to the role of communication in health and public health in a pretty new way. So going back to pre-COVID, how did you come to realize the value of communication, what you were doing? How did you see it as like a strength that added to everything else you were doing? Because that was, I think, something a lot of people weren't as aware of pre-COVID as they might be now.
So, I think a couple of reasons. So the one reason is that I also was very lucky that I crossed paths with Peter Hotez, and many of you maybe know who Peter is. I mean, I've been working with him now almost 23 years. And when we joined and started working together was at the turn of the century, so 2001-ish. Many things were happening in the convergence of global health. Certainly, there were a lot of things happening that, in our case, global health topics were kind of resurging, infectious diseases. But I think where it hit us was we were actually in the DC area when the whole anthrax kind of thing happened, right? And being in DC, of course, Peter was certainly as a physician himself, but also as a being in where we were, I saw immediately how he was kind of, absorbed by having to respond, especially when you have these biodefense and these kind of emergencies. So I started kind of peeking and kind of paying attention, but I was always very afraid. I honestly tell you, I was like, oh my God, I could never do this kind of stuff. And since Peter was already doing it, I was like, oh, great. Peter is great at doing that. I don't have to worry about it too much. But then when, of course, you always chase money, right, to how to support and how to kind of do better the work that we do. And there were these centers of biodefense that they were kind of like little boats that were launched by the NIH. And we competed with one of these regional centers of biodefense within the DC, Virginia, Maryland area. And believe it or not, how we competed was because in George Washington University, they have a big, remember where they used to tape Meet the Press? They have a big studio for, kind of like journalism. And we leveraged that to apply for money to indeed how to train scientists to be better communicators when especially you have these crises. Because Peter kind of winged it, right? I mean, at that time, and we saw how it was difficult for having, scientists kind of just be thrown, especially in the journalistic kind of arena. So I, again, started paying attention a little bit on that. And then, of course, as we saw that more of these pandemics or emergencies, or that funders also were starting to ask different questions. It wasn't as simple as writing the scientific proposal. Or I started witnessing, for example, Peter also started doing a lot more with our legislators, like going into Capitol Hill, right? And talking to the Congress and the state, and all these. And I was like, and again, I was like, oh, I'm not going to do that ever. It's like, this is not me. I'm like, let him do all that. I'll deal with things behind the scenes. But then when COVID started, and thank God I actually managed to get on that AAAS thing, fellowship, literally a year before, right? It was like meant to be. I said, I need to have that moral courage and I need to throw myself in. And then it was all, at the beginning, it was very hard. Everything, I wanted to script everything, even the line, right? Now I'm like, what? Let's wing it. Whatever it is. But because it's all practice, right? But you have the basis behind it. So I think that's how it all started. And then we started recognizing how in academia, we just don't have the infrastructure to really teach the new generations to do this. So that's why when certainly people's community said, can you come and do something with Mark? I said, absolutely, because there's not very many centers for health communication embedded in an academic system. I mean, we have communications offices, but they very rarely train. They're just there to maybe pitch some news out there, but not to formally really teach us how to do this.
So one of the tricks whenever we talk about COVID is that it was the world's worst communication challenge, because what we were learning as we went. And so there was the 2 months that it was like you were supposed to wipe your groceries down with Lysol, and then it turns out we didn't need to do that. And the result is it seems like no one ever knows what they're talking about. I have a pharmacy colleague here on campus who calls it science in motion. And so we don't usually get to talk to the people doing the science on the science in motion. So what was it like to be like doing that and talking to reporters, and what are some of the either lessons you learned or mistakes you saw other people making that you wish we could do better the next time we have to do this?
Yes, I think for us in general, I think you nailed it, right? I mean, it was a very big science communications failure for many, many, many reasons. But one of the reasons is that we assumed, as scientists, we assume people understand that scientific knowledge is flexible and it's not static. And I think the way that it was communicated is that, it's black or white. And science is never fully black or white, because as you evolve, you're always learning something new, right? I mean, thank God, at least we knew it was a coronavirus, but of course, because we knew a lot about coronaviruses in general, but we really didn't know anything about this specific coronavirus. So you start making inferences, assumptions, then you go behind the scenes and do the experiments, and then find out that it wasn't really that we said that was supposed to be the right answer, but we had to pivot, we had to adapt, we had to be flexible. And that was never really explained, right? That if I tell you today, based on the knowledge I have today, we have to do this. But then tomorrow I found something else. And maybe tomorrow I say, however, now that I know more, we can probably adjust and adapt and give different types of recommendations. And I think people just thought that when we were doing those things, that we were just flip-flopping and that we never knew what we were saying and that we were inventing, or that we were, and I think that's also the fact that we don't communicate by explaining in general, the process. We also, I think, sometimes think that because we're scientists, we're like, we're like geniuses of sorts, right? And that when you speak to the general, communities, that, they would never understand what I'm saying because my level of knowledge is so, right? And so I think it's also take for granted that people wouldn't really understand if we really explained it to them how it is, right? With, layman terms, but still letting them know that people are intelligent. I mean, people can understand what we can say. We can't automatically think, oh, they'll never understand, so we'll give them like the minimal of the information. So I think that we made also that mistake. In my specific case, maybe just a little story is, I know that people have seen Peter all over the news and mostly here in the US. Maybe people don't realize I started doing a lot also overseas. I took, for example, a big charge of trying to do this in a country like Honduras, where we don't even have formal scientific journalism, right? I mean, our journalism is, unfortunately, is very dramatic because it's always corruption, politics, never science journalism. So you even had to pick the journalist and even start even at an even more basic level because they've never even done that before. And how do you really work with them to say, look, just think through of how you portray the news, because you also are dealing with people who are really suffering right now. So it was very interesting, the dynamics that I had to do. And it was very different, the dynamics here versus the dynamics in other places.
So you mentioned scientists aren't trained to do this a whole lot. We spend as a center a lot of time, some training programs for undergrads at UT. We have other things that are really designed for public health professionals and clinicians who are out in the real world already kind of doing their jobs. If you could do what you wanted to do, how do we better train future scientists, future physicians to be better at communicating either with their patients or with reporters and the general public? Like, how could we do that better so we raise a generation of future scientists and physicians who are better at this?
Well, certainly I wouldn't take the engagement component as just a hobby. I think our institutions still, for the most part, consider it a little bit as a hobby, right? You're here to do what you're hired to do, like, me, a researcher, or you, a medical student, or you, a physician. And if you have time, sure, go off and do your, engagement, but it's not part of the formal requirement. In fact, we still don't really get credit, even in our promotion paths. There's no, we click the box on being scholarly, but scholarly really means how many papers did you publish in the supposed to be impact, high impact factor journals. But nobody clicks the box and say, did you go out and went to speak to your community? Did you go to a high school? Did you go to, they still are not considering it as an essential component of what you do. And therefore the curriculum, even if, and I know that you're saying that you have this center and that you do a lot of the training, but the training should not be there. It should be within, right? So if, in our classes, for example, and we don't do a lot of pure didactics anymore. I mean, as you know, they're more like applied types of education. We do a lot of our training within our labs, right? And if somebody wants to learn how to do vaccine development, yes, I can give you the PowerPoint lecture, but it's a lot better if you then come and see how we do it in the lab, right? And so when then we go into the lab, we then walk through at all levels, even the behind the scenes. How do you even do the business, the project management? How do you consider the economics? How do you consider, therefore, the engagement? And why is it important for me to come and do these kinds of things, or go to the people's clinic and be a keynote speaker at an event where they're actually seeking for support for the clinic, right? I mean, they're all different objectives of the engagement, but you use that opportunity to also tell your own stories, or even use them as case studies of why convergence and interdisciplinarity and cross disciplines is so important to do. So my hope is that your center, which I know it's already pretty integrated, you've explained it to me a little bit more, but that it's not there versus here, that it's all, that it's just automatically part of every course, every class, every training program has to have a measurement of are you getting competencies in the science of engagement and communication.
Well, I'm going to ask one last question, then open it up for others in the room. But something you were talking about at the People's Luncheon that I thought was kind of interesting was you were talking about building capacity both locally, but then also abroad. And so you talked about it really briefly there, but I wanted to see if you could expand on that a little bit and even talk about how communication is a part of the way you think about that capacity building, both locally in your own community and then outreach beyond.
I'm not by any means a social scientist at all, but I think that's another thing that maybe we in the biomedical sciences disregard, or maybe don't give the prominence that's the social behavioral, I guess, how we humans are. We're very complicated, and we're very complex as a species, right? And we've, unfortunately, there were always, especially in health, there's always been these hierarchies, and you've seen it, in the history, right? There's always the colonialism, there's always the North versus the South, or the more industrial and the less industrial. And I think that for us to really achieve real equity in anything, not only in health, but in everything, we really have to break those barriers. And for us to break those barriers is not by any means saying that, for example, I did go to school in Honduras, and my education to me was perfect. I mean, I got a lot of amazing skills, but it was appropriate for how I was learning there. I was very thrown into what we call the field studies, right? Microbiology, but out in the field, interacting with people. But I never really got like the molecular, those more high technology skills. And that's what we do very well up here. But here, very rarely you are thrown in the field, right? I mean, I see some of the way that, even med students or others learn. Everything is on a slide, on a PowerPoint. I used to go to the real amphitheater where all the cadavers were, and you actually had to fish them out from the, big containers and do, understand. Now I think you don't really have a lot of opportunities of doing really hands-on. And so that requires, therefore, to not take for granted that us in the North are better than the South, but for us to really enable knowledge and communication, you have to empower them and therefore help them strengthen their capacity. But it's even more than strengthening the capacity, because the capacity is already there. It's just that if we don't even know how to communicate, imagine them. They don't even have a voice because we are overshadowing that voice. You see it in many collaborations, right? When you even see the publications, it's always the authors of the up here that shadow the authors of the down there. Or it's never very clear what exactly did they do. And for the most part, a lot of the work is actually done in the partner institutions in Honduras or Asia or Africa or wherever. And so I think that for us is to break a little bit those barriers and have a different paradigm of when we design our partnerships and our programs, that we do it by ensuring that they are as accountable as us, because we have to be, that they also have a voice and that they can therefore contribute by having a voice within the decision making and within the design. And I think that's what we've been trying to do for now more than 20 years.
All right. Do we have any other questions from folks in the room? Susan.
I heard you say that in terms of thinking about Mike's question about COVID communication, where we could get better. I think I heard you say that we shouldn't underestimate people's ability to understand sort of the evolution process. But then what I also hear whenever I'm putting together communication is that it needs to be as short and to the point as possible. Mm-hmm. And there's a time to explain the evolution behind, how science works. How do you balance those two things?
Yes. Well, I think it's because if you start doing the communication when the actual crisis and disaster happens, it's too late, right? So the way that you ideally would want to achieve it, when then in an emergency you go to the point and concise and short, it's because you've been building that trust and building that kind of sharing of information that may be generic in general, right? Like in our case, the importance of vaccines, the importance of vaccinations, the fact that, for example, not a lot of people knew that we've been working on coronaviruses and specifically in creating prototypes of vaccines against coronaviruses for at least a decade, if not more. And people automatically, the only thing that they could hear is, oh, these vaccines were made very fast, and how therefore could they be safe, if they were so fast? Because throughout the prior 10, 15 years, nobody was really communicating that anybody was behind the scenes developing vaccines. So I think it's that stop and go approach, which is not only in communication, it's everywhere, right? Even in funding. If you do stop and go, you don't have that continuity, and therefore just people forget, right? So you just have to do it continuously, I think.
That always struck me as it was a really unfortunate name to call it Operation Warp Speed, because you had to know a lot to be like, oh, this is building on years and years and years worth of work, and then we pushed really hard at the end.
I mean, that's
not how normal people. That's not how normal people hear.
Example, right? It's you would think that behind the scenes you have very, knowledgeable communications offices that weigh on, it's like, if we use this terminology, what is it going to trigger? If we would have used something else, what is it going to trigger? And I think the poor use of words, the poor, the explanation of the information, who you also select as your communicator. So if you notice, Operation Warp Speed, with all in all, whatever they were charged to do, it pretty much stopped at saying, we're going to give the money, but we're going to give all the communication authorities to the companies. And then the companies didn't really particularly care to speak to the communities as, in theory, a governmental agency would, as a, taking care of of your community. They were really speaking to their stakeholders. So the audience of the companies was not the ideal audience that Operation Warp Speed should have been talking to, and they just relinquished that, to them. And then they were just like, that's no wonder, people were just hearing, results of, clinical trials in a press release, which basically they were just sending messages to their own stakeholders and not necessarily explaining to the people who were really, in the receiving end.
Yeah, okay.
What advice do you have for sort of communication professionals that want to collaborate with life science professionals? And then how do you think they should approach getting their own hands around health topics that has conflicting views, or is science in motion, as you said earlier?
I think there's two sides to the coin, right? I mean, so where eventually would you eventually end up working in, right? So if you end up working in a communications office, like again, in an academic, let's say, communications office, or a company that has a communications office, it's break that, I guess, that model of what is the communications office there to do, which is just to take the information, write it into a nice press release, and then kind of try to advocate it, but not really work and embed yourself within the group that are actually doing the discoveries. And on the same side, I think it's us, so one of the things I learned is when the traditional way of when you scientists are hired, I'm going to say hired, like, if I'm a PhD student and when I go into a university, I'm going to get trained, or then I became a postdoc and then I was hired as a faculty. I was only interested in meeting my fellow peer scientists, and who's in my lab next door, or who's the other colleague that works next to my bench. And now I have learned that as much as they are, of course, very important, and you need to have scientific, discussions, the first people I go meet are my general counsel, because they always have to be there, right, to help me, make sure I don't screw up, and then, and if I need help, especially with all the contracts and stuff, I need to get engaged with my licensing group, because again, if I am interested in advocating for open science or whatever it is I want to do with my discoveries, I better understand that philosophy and not having them be either a barrier or not understanding what I want to do. And then likely the third office that was actually two more offices, government affairs, because if you are going to say anything out there, and especially if you're going to touch any controversial topic that can interfere with your state or federal, whatever, your government affairs officers you have to make sure they coach you, right? Make sure. And then the communications office. So as much as I definitely think that my scientist peers are important, now I know that the mistake is that people never make the effort of going meeting those people, and therefore then inviting them to go beyond just the role that you all play when you're hired to be part of a communications office. So more interaction, I think, from the beginning, even not even knowing, like sometimes I feel that they come to me and, what are you doing? I'm doing all this work, and I explain them, but there's nothing interesting yet. But then when there's something interesting, again, it's too late, right? There hasn't been continuity, and then the learning curve of those individuals like that work in these offices, it's a steep learning curve because they haven't been involved in experiencing what we have been experiencing along the way.
Other questions?
At the lunch earlier, with the story was told that I'm still chewing on like he had the vaccine all certified, so that you were talking about being culturally intelligent. I think in our work in communication, we talk about being culturally competent a lot, but I can't imagine. I don't know because I don't see any lab, but I wonder if you're having to bring your colleagues around some of those issues and where you think you learned that from, if you weren't taught that in microbiology.
Well, I think that may come from, well, unfortunately, women and women in science, it has not been easy, right? For many women, other disciplines too, but in general, being a woman and a woman in science, now it's a little bit better, but that already gives you a little bit more of a resilience of paying attention, or even trying to figure out how to get yourself inserted into certainly a male-dominated, or even just a structure that you may not have as a loud voice as others. So that, I think, is one thing. Second, being Hispanic, in my case specifically, it has not been easy either, right? Because there's always, there's people have a lot of perceptions, biases. The world, again, not being a social scientist, but clearly we human beings are very complicated, even in how we interpret things. So when we, and I say we because with Peter, we've been, trying to work together and create a team, right? Because, we don't do things just by ourselves. We had to create a team. We immediately, therefore, recognized that the diversity and the differences, by bringing within our team, not only differences in biomedical disciplines, like me, microbiologist, you biochemist, or you immunologist, but also bringing people who are from different regions of the world with different cultures. It was important because it again equalizes a little bit, the empowering people. But then through those interactions, we realized that bringing a vaccine to Honduras, it is very different than bringing a vaccine to a country in the Middle East, and even just trying to bring a vaccine in the U.S. I don't know if you may have noticed, but our vaccines were unable to come into the U.S. Right? We could not convince anyone in the United States for free, because it's literally for free, to just come and take our technology and make the vaccine here. And we can elaborate of some of the reasons why not. But then when we started seeing that we would, therefore, most likely many of our vaccines would, have the same example as the COVID vaccine, because we don't see anybody lining up to ask for, us to help make a hookworm vaccine or any other of these parasitic vaccines here in the US. We knew that we had to work overseas. But then we said, okay, but who will use a vaccine overseas? And if you're in a Muslim majority country, they're very special about, their beliefs and their culture and their religion. And we knew we had to at least enable something. And the only easy thing we could do is learn about it. So what did it mean if I were a Muslim individual, and what it means for me to go to the doctor and get health care, and including vaccinations. And so we learned from some of our teammates that, they are very particular about who and how they receive these types of services. And then it was just a matter of understanding the regulatory component, right? How do you document, and how do you, how do they check the box to enable a certification? In this case, halal is of course, porcine derived anything, it's the key, right? They don't eat pork. And believe it or not, sometimes you can buy reagents that seem, could be sera that came from, a porcine model, right? I mean, there's so many things behind the scenes that you don't necessarily maybe realize in science. So we had to make sure we checked and then document. And so when they audited us in our records, because we gave them the seed where they created the vaccine, the actual starter kit, let's call it, they needed to see how we generated that physically. How did we make it? And if we didn't have the records, that actually, it was a negative record, right? Because you had to show what it had, which therefore it told them it had no porcine derived materials. And without that, we wouldn't have been able to enable that certification. So it's all kind of like thinking through, but learning from people who were surrounding us that gave us the ideas, right?
Well, I have a question, because when you were at the luncheon, you were also talking about sort of open science. And so we're part of a project here on campus that one of the goals is to get people in a cohort study their data back real time, rather than read the article 10 years ago, like 10 years in the future in JAMA, and then go back in time and make different decisions. So can you talk a little bit more about kind of open science and the role of communication in doing the kind of work you're doing as it relates to kind of this open science, community-based kind of version of knowledge generation in science?
Yes. Well, that is also a movement that probably also started seriously, again, with the turn of the century, where there was this intent of course, sharing more. And share, it can be share amongst just a small group, but at least share reagents and share recipes and share protocols and whatnot. But of course, then it started morphing into being what you just said, right? It's if I'm gonna do work that invites you as a participant, that I'm gonna even take samples from you, or that I'm gonna take information from you. I mean, it's to me, it's just common sense that that individual can be invited even early, even in the design of what we want to try to do, by utilizing us, even us as humans, as test models, right? I mean, right now, to be very honest, it's very in fashion, if that's a good word to use. Maybe it's not. That for years there was a time where preclinical animal models, of course, were prioritized because it was a lot more difficult to work with humans. Then it was morphed to try to reduce also the burden on animal systems, do more in what we call in vitro technologies. We have, of course, all these omics now, the genomics, proteomics and all that. But eventually the intent is to find solutions that, of course, would benefit us as humans, and even back to the environment and veterinary. So that was therefore even more and more important, to really be more, to invite them to participate. As an example of communications, I think it's morphed into many dimensions, right? So scientifically, as you've seen, even the way that journals work, right? The fact that eventually there was the open access model, right? That, yeah, you pay more and then you can make your article open access. Now they even have some of these publication companies have ways where, okay, I can open it up, you can read it, you cannot download it, but at least it's free for you to read, which is certainly better than not even being able to read the article, even if you cannot download it. But now you've seen that now we have even these preprint servers. So me, as the creator of the information, I can just put it out publicly, not peer reviewed or anything, then eventually gets reviewed and maybe even closed, or at some level open access. But at least it's been out in the preprint server, right? And it has its pros and cons, because you cannot monitor everything that gets uploaded. But last thing that I can say is, with this open science, open model, is again, it's that ability of equalizing the knowledge, right? that, that again, that not only because you have enough money that you could publish, or that you could generate the data, or that you could, own the data, that has to disappear, right? And we know that, again, it's a lot of pretty colonialism mentality, right? Because most of the time, all these big studies, especially human studies, they're led by big funding agencies and money from big organizations from the global north. The data is all owned by these big institutions, some of them even big Ivy League institutions. And then the people who are the ones who really enable that work, they don't, they claim they have a benefit, but they really never do. And I think that's where we think we need to change that paradigm.
Well, we're going to be coming up on the end of time pretty soon here. Would you be willing to share, maybe as one last question or one last thought, something that, given the last several years that we've been through, on a more uplifting note, like a lesson you think that we've learned, or you're hoping that, like, when we have to do this again, something that you feel confident we'll actually do better the next time, so we can finish on a positive note?
Well, I think that we certainly, with the, one of the questions is, we certainly understand now that communications should not be an afterthought, right? That, we have to craft it better, and therefore for us to craft it better, we have to start now, right? We cannot wait until we have another outbreak or pandemic or epidemic to start thinking of how you would do it. So behind the scenes, I think people should, again, going back to you, is like, should embed communication knowledgeable officers that are not in an office there, but that are part of our teams. So for example, in our team, we have people who maybe we're not 100% trained, but we add that dimension to everything that we do. So I think that has changed, and I think it's going to be much better for next time. I think that's point one. I think the other aspect is there's always two sides, again, another two sides of the coin, right? You have those who do the communication, but you have to have someone who can measure the impact. And sometimes you don't realize that you have to also train those who can do the monitoring and evaluation of the different ways of doing communication. And I was actually, I had an experience, again, pre-COVID, again, I was really lucky, where through being a Leshner Fellow, then I got invited, for example, to the Kavli Foundation. And the Kavli Foundation was actually training the trainers of how to then, train the communicators. But I learned how the trainers really decide how to create the curriculum for you to then, teach them to people like me. And how do they monitor whether I learned or whether, things change? So I think we're going to see more of that yin yang with us, which are forever going to be trainees, because it's a continuous process, but giving more importance to those who really do the training, and really embedded within everything that we do.
It's funny. One of the faculty here in the College of Communication worked with the School of Pharmacy to redesign their communication for pharmacy class. And for the pharmacy school, it was like, how do we train our future pharmacists? Yeah. And for her, it was like just one giant 3-year healthcom research experiment. Yeah. Like, how could they see how we were helping improve how they were communicating? How could we test it? How could we prove it? So it was a very, we had different views on what the same work was, which was kind of fun.
Yeah.
So.
And how do you really measure that? Because then that you can go back and say, look, this is the value of it, right? One of the things with our vaccines, it's sometimes hard to really quantify a value when the value sometimes, one, you don't see it tomorrow, you see it maybe 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, right? From saving a life of a kid today that has a productive, healthy, lifespan. I cannot see the impact of the work that I do tomorrow. I see it later. And I think that that is the same with, communications, right? The value is going to be cumulative, and you're going to really see it as you train and you see how others understand it better.
Well, I just want to say thanks again so much for being here today. It was just 4 really different speakers over the course of the semester, which made this a lot of fun. So thanks again to Joy and People's Community Clinic for helping make this happen. Really appreciate the partnership. Thanks everyone here today and all the folks on Zoom, wherever you are. And thanks again today. We really appreciate the chance to have you here.
No, thank you. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation. Great. Thank you.